Thank you very much, Alicia. I want to say at the beginning how pleased I am to be here with you tonight. For the past several years, we've been doing virtual programs, and it's great to see real people in a real setting. I also appreciate the work that Alicia and her colleagues at the American Center in Minsk have done, not only for this program, but for the interests of the people of Belarus generally. I know that part of the world because all four of my grandparents and my father were born in Ukraine. And so I know what the citizens of Ukraine and Belarus are going through right now. Now, this evening, I would like to talk about American politics. And to begin, I want to give you a historical perspective on how we got to where we are today. American politics has gone through several different phases since we began as a nation under the Constitution in 1787. Let's see. Okay. Okay. This is a scene of voting day in 1815. In 1815, all of the people who could vote had to own property throughout the United States. And of course, only men could vote. Well, okay. There we go. Okay. Of course, only men could vote. And you can see that the women are here with their children, but they're outside the voting place. Voting was a holiday. It's not a holiday anymore. It's just a regular Tuesday, which of course makes voting much more difficult because most Americans work on Tuesdays, and most American youngsters go to school on Tuesdays. So we have a different perspective on voting today than we did in the early 19th century. The first major change in American politics came with this man, President Andrew Jackson. He had the idea that not only men with property, but all men should be able to vote. And so he campaigned as for president in 1828, and he significantly expanded the franchise. At that time, in some states in the United States, Roman Catholics could not vote. In some states, Jewish voters could not vote. But Andrew Jackson abolished all of that. And he founded a new party called the Democratic Party. And it's not a surprise that when Andrew Jackson ran for re-election, president, in 1832, he got about 90% of the Roman Catholic and Jewish vote in the United States. And even to this are overwhelmingly Democratic. In the 2020 presidential election, for example, Jewish voters gave Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, 72% of their votes, which is a very high percentage. However, a new political era began in the 1850s, and this was over the issue of slavery. And what we see here is an illustration from a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe that was published in 1852 and called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a sensational book because Stowe made the institution of slavery not as some political issue, but she made it personal. As the slave Tom, you see here, dies from the wounds inflicted on him by his master. And up until that time, 1852, most Americans in the North, where there was very little slavery, most Americans in the North didn't pay much attention to the issue. But they did now. It's unusual for one book, other than the Bible, it's unusual for one book to create such a political change. And slavery became a very contentious issue, not only among the people, but also among their elected representatives. In fact, in 1856, Senator Charles Sumner, who opposed slavery, he was from Massachusetts, was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate in Washington, D.C., because of his anti-slavery views. If you think American politics is rough now, it was pretty rough then. But there was also another issue that emerged in the 1850s. Between 1848 and 1858, that's just 10 years, over 1 million Irish immigrants came to the U.S. Almost all of those Irish immigrants were Roman Catholic. And because of the Democratic Party's appeal to Roman Catholics, they voted for the Democratic Party. A new party was founded called the Republican Party. And the Republican Party rested on two pillars. One pillar was anti-slavery, so the party really only existed in the North. And the second pillar was anti-Catholicism. In fact, when Abraham Lincoln ran for the U.S. Senate in Illinois in 1858, the slogan of the Illinois Democratic Party, the slogan of the Illinois Republican Party of that year was "Vanquish the twin despotisms, slavery and Catholicism." And this cartoon by the famous American cartoonist Thomas Nast. Many of you are familiar with the English word nasty. Thomas Nast, that's where we get nasty from. In this particular cartoon drawing, you see a young man protecting children from alligators coming ashore. But if you look closely, the alligators are really Roman Catholic priests. And in the background, there is a replica of the Vatican. See that big building? And instead of Roman Catholic Church on it, it says Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the center of New York Democratic politics. And New York City was the most democratic city in the nation. So you see, the anti-Catholic sentiment generated a great deal of fear. Fear not only toward the Irish, but toward an entire religion. And this combined with anti-slavery. In fact, the conflict between Catholics and Protestants was so great in America that in the mid-1850s, religious war broke out in many cities. The worst was in New York City between Catholics and Protestants. I don't know how many of you have seen the Martin Scorsese film, Gangs of New York, but that depicts the brutal conflict between Catholics and Protestants. But this was all across the North. In the South, Catholics got along with Protestants well. There was really no conflict. But this was not the case in northern cities, primarily because most Catholics tend to settle in northern cities where there was work. So, in 1860, the issue of slavery and the issue of immigration came together to create a big political problem. And here you see that in 1860, there were actually 4 presidential candidates. In most American elections, there are only 2, Democrats and Republicans. But what happened in 1860 was that the Democratic Party split in half. The Northern Democratic Party nominated Stephen A. Douglas, and the Southern Democratic Party nominated John C. Breckinridge, who was a senator from Kentucky. Douglas was from Illinois. And the Republican Party candidate was Abraham Lincoln. And there was a fourth candidate from a new party called the Constitutional Union Party. And he was a senator from Tennessee, and his name was John Bell. And he hoped that his moderate view that we should all come together as a nation would prevail and would result in his election. But that was not the case. And here we see the 1860 electoral map. The red is Republican, blue is Democrat, and the light brown is the Constitutional Union Party. And the numbers you see are not the numbers of votes. They're the numbers of electoral votes. And this is an important point to keep in mind, because I've voted in every presidential election since I was old enough to vote, but I have never voted for the president. Instead, American voters, when they cast their ballots for the president, vote for electors pledged to Joe Biden or electors pledged to Donald Trump or electors pledged to Abraham Lincoln or electors pledged to Stephen Douglas. It is a strange system, and it is a system that I think needs to be replaced, because 2 times since 2000, the candidate for president in the United States who received the most votes did not win the presidency. That happened in 2000 with George W. Bush, and it happened in 2016 with Donald Trump, and it will happen again. So something needs to be done basically in the American political system, because every other election, the person with the most votes wins. That makes sense, right? You get the most votes, you win. Not for president. And when the Constitution was framed in 1787, the reason for the Electoral College was that, well, the people might not know the candidates. Suppose there is a candidate from Massachusetts running for president. Does a voter in Georgia really know him? No. So we need to have electors. Who are these electors? I couldn't give you the name of one elector in North Carolina. Not one. Usually they are local officials, prominent individuals that very few people know. It is a very strange system. Now, of course, after the Civil War, which the North won, slavery was over. So that issue was off the table. And here you see some former slaves trying to register to vote. did not work. Although we had a new amendment to our Constitution which guaranteed the right of former slaves to vote, in the South, Southern states passed laws that limited or even prohibited the right to vote, in contradiction of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. And the reason why Northerners did not challenge this is they wanted to do the same with Irish voters, Catholic voters. And here you see another Thomas Nast cartoon from 1876. On one side, you see north, the other side, south. On the north side, you see someone who looks sort of like a monkey, right? That was how Thomas Nast depicted Irish people, like monkeys. And on the other side was a black man. And as you can see, it's a caricature. But there were significant political problems aside from immigration and race in America in the late 19th century, particularly as America began to industrialize and the gap in wealth began to grow, particularly the gap between the very wealthy and the workers. So a new party was born in 1896, and that party was called the Populist Party. And here you see a cartoon with the farmer. Most of them were farmers, because farmers were really the ones who were hurting the most. We were still, at this point, mostly a rural, small-town nation. Now, women at the time said, hey, why can't we vote? Only men could vote. So the women's suffrage movement began. And just as Andrew Jackson increased the suffrage, abolished property qualifications, abolished religious qualifications, so too did President Woodrow Wilson in the early 20th century state that it was time to give women the right to vote. Now, there were many arguments against that. One argument, oh, they'll just vote like their husbands. Another argument was, oh, they don't really know about politics. Politics is dirty, and they should not get involved. But there were obvious issues that women were very interested in and affected them, and they had no voice. The same with immigrants. Beginning in 1890, from 1890 to 1920, 14 million new immigrants came to America. Almost all of them were Roman Catholic and Jewish. The Roman Catholic immigrants came from Eastern Europe, Poland, what is now the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states. And the Jewish immigrants came primarily from what is now Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And they touched off a reaction in America against them. Americans didn't like Roman Catholics to begin with, but now, all of a sudden, these Roman Catholics were coming from other countries. So, in 1924, and here you see a cartoon of Uncle Sam, and the man trying to enter the U.S. Is a Jewish immigrant from Russia, and he's bringing all sorts of problems with him. And you can see he's bringing poverty, disease, Sabbath desecration, and political radicalism. So in 1924, the U.S. Congress changed our immigration law and severely limited immigration from countries where Roman Catholics and Jewish residents lived. So, for example, Great Britain, which is a Protestant country, had a limit of 40,000 immigrants. Greece, which is an Orthodox country, had a limit of 305. So that gives you some idea of the prejudice against immigration, and particularly immigration by these two religious groups. And after World War II, when refugees from Poland, mostly Roman Catholic, and refugees from other parts of Europe, mostly Jewish, tried to get into the United States, Congress prohibited it and limited it. And this cartoon shows the Statue of Liberty, which I'm sure you all know, shows the Statue of Liberty holding up her hand. No, we don't want those people coming into the United States. Now, Americans like to think of themselves as a nation of immigrants, but it depends on what immigrant you are. But in the 1950s, there was another issue left over from the Civil War 100 years earlier, and that was the issue of race, particularly in the American South. And the issue was, if you are black, why can't I enjoy all of the rights and privileges of citizenship that white people enjoy? Why do I have to go to a separate school, an inferior school? Why do I have to live in an inferior neighborhood? Why can't I go into that restaurant that serves good food? Why can't I get a loan at the bank? Because I am black. So the civil rights movement generated another political transformation in America. Up until the 1950s, the voters in the South, who were overwhelmingly white because they limited or eliminated black voters, voted for the Democratic Party. Why? Because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And the Republicans made war against the South during the Civil War. So if you were a true Southerner, you voted for the Democratic Party. When my parents moved from Michigan, which is way up north, to Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, they wanted to register to vote. They could only register for one political party, the Democratic Party. There was no Republican Party. And this was true of most areas in the Deep South. You either were a Democrat or you just didn't participate in politics. But because the Democratic president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who ironically was a Southern Democrat, pushed through the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, ending segregation, guaranteeing the right of black people to vote. And the efforts of blacks themselves to desegregate the South, even at the cost of violence. I remember this very well as a little boy, this scene. My family is gathered in front of the TV, and the television network on Sunday evening showed first-run films. Can you imagine? You did not have to go to a movie theater to see a new film. You can watch it on television. So there we were watching the new film on television, and the film that Sunday night was Judgment at Nuremberg, about the Nuremberg trials of the Nazis. And suddenly, the television screen went blank. And this scene came on the television. And at first we thought, well, this is just a continuation of Germans beating up on people. But no, America saw what life was like for black people in the Deep South, because what these police were doing was preventing black people in Alabama from marching to the state capitol to demand the right to vote. And the result of this, which shocked the nation, the result of this was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And here you see in Alabama, black citizens lining up to register. But this created a major change in American politics, because Southern whites left the Democratic Party, because Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat and the Congress was controlled by Democrats. And the Republicans said, hey, if we take a very conservative view on race, we could win the votes of Democrats. And this man, you see in the center with the white shirt and tie, George Wallace, tried to take advantage of this. He was governor of Alabama, and he wanted to run for president. And people said, no way. Nobody outside of the Deep South is going to vote for you. But in the primaries, which precede the general election, he won in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, and Maryland, all northern states. But because of our electoral college system, he really did not accumulate the number of electoral votes necessary. And this is another thing about the electoral college. If you're a third-party candidate, in 1992, Ross Perot was a third-party candidate. He got 20% of the vote, of the popular vote. How many electoral votes did he get? 0. Because in order to get electoral votes of a state, it's winner take all. And if you don't win any states, you could accumulate lots of votes, but come up with 0. So let's take a look at the 1968 election results. Again, red is Republican and blue is Democrat. And if you're wondering why those colors, in 1980, the NBC television network in America was about to show the 1980 presidential election returns. And they said, hey, everybody in America has a color television, so let's make this colorful. Let's make the Democrats blue and the Republicans red. So that's how we got red states and blue states from a television network. Well, you see in this vote in 1968, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, won. The solid Democratic South was gone. They voted for George Wallace, the third-party candidate. But of course, Richard Nixon got the most electoral votes. Now, so today we have two parties, Democrats and Republicans, and two coalitions. Democratic voters tend to be younger. Republican, also known as GOP, Grand Old Party, that's from the Civil War, tend to be older. Democrats, women tend to vote for Democrats. Men, not so much. Unmarried, married, multiracial, mostly white for Republicans. The Democrats are the party of cities, small cities, and particularly coastal states. The Republicans are the party of rural, exurban, heartland states. The Democrats are secular. They are not frequent churchgoers. But there are two religious groups that consistently vote Democratic, the Jewish voters and Muslim voters. And they both vote generally the same percentage, about 71, 72%. For the Republicans, regular churchgoers, particularly white Protestants and evangelicals. Evangelical Protestants gave Donald Trump 81% of their vote in 2020. And Catholics non-Hispanic Catholics tend now to vote Republican. Hispanic Catholics tend to vote Democratic, but there aren't as many of them. So, in the 2020 presidential election, again, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. And you can see here that if you didn't know anything, you would say, well, this looks like a very close election. There's lots of red states. But there are also some blue states, maybe even more red than blue. But Biden won the electoral vote easily, 306 to 232. You need 270 to win. And we are now in another phase of the transformation of American politics. And that is the South, which was solidly Republican for 40 or 50 years, is now breaking up. Virginia and Georgia, I'll point them out. Georgia with 16, Virginia with 13, and my state of North Carolina moves Republican or Democrat, depending on the candidate. Now, these are what we call the battleground states in 2020. Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and the states of the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and in the far west, Arizona and Nevada. These are the states that will determine the 2024 presidential election. The political candidates for each party, the presidential candidates for each party, will not campaign in all 50 states. Waste of time. I know today that New York State and California are going to vote for the Democratic candidate, even if it's Mickey Mouse. I also know that Indiana, North Dakota, Missouri, those states will vote Republican, regardless of who the candidate is. But these are the battleground states, and there are only 8 or 9 of them. So most of a candidate's time will be spent in those states. Most of the advertising and visits and speeches will be spent in those states. Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada. And Joe Biden owed his victory in 2020 by taking Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona and Nevada. If you win battleground states, you win the presidency, because the other states are not competitive. If you live in California, you know today that the Democratic candidate is going to win that state. Just very, very simple. But if you live in North Carolina or Georgia, it's not so clear. Now, the key here is that instead of North versus South, which became the center for American politics since the Civil War, instead of North and South, it's really urban, rural. Urban, rural. In my state of North Carolina, my county, Mecklenburg County, was settled by Germans. Mecklenburg County in 2020 went 69% for Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate. Urban counties give Democrats big majorities. But again, it's not the popular vote. It's the electoral college. And that's what you've got to win. So if you win the states with big cities, and most of those states are located on the Atlantic coast and on the Pacific coast, but lose everything in between, you're going to lose the presidential election. Now, we had something called reapportionment. That is, some states gained electoral votes because they gained population. The electoral votes are based on population. And some states lost. And based in the 2020 census. And that will have an impact on 2024 presidential election. But the impact is very small. Running the numbers of 2020 for 2024 with these new population statistics, Biden would have lost 3 electoral votes, which would still give him well over 270. So that's not going to make much difference. But look, here's the thing about American politics today. It's really urban versus small town and rural. Maybe that's similar here in Poland, too, in terms of politics. This is Virginia. Now, it looks here, again, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. Well, it looks like the Republican won pretty easily. No, the Democrat won pretty easily because the large cities, the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the state capital of Richmond, and the big seaport of Norfolk are hugely Democratic. Or take Michigan. Now you look at the map of Michigan for 2020, it's almost all red, right? It's almost all red. But Joe Biden, the Democrat, won Michigan. He won Michigan because those blue places, Detroit, Flint, Grand Rapids. If you win the big population centers in the state, the rest of the state is small towns and rural. And you can see Michigan really is a Republican state. But because of the concentration of Democrats in cities, they can't outvote the cities. So, just to give you the numbers of what's going to happen next year, right now, today, the House of Representatives, we have 2 bodies in our legislature, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The House of Representatives today has 220 Republicans, 213 Democrats. So you need 218 for a majority. So it's very, very close, very close. In the Senate today, we have 49 Republicans, 48 Democrats, and 3 independents. That's for a total of 100. But the independents almost always vote with the Democrats. So the Democrats have a majority, 51 to 49. But, and this is an important point, in 2024, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. Senators have terms of 6 years. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. And this coming year, 20 Democrats are in that group, only 10 Republicans, which means that the Democrats have more exposure to losing. So that will be interesting to watch as well. What will be the issues of what are the issues of the 2024 presidential election? Well, there are three major issues in any presidential campaign, except in 1944. That was the exception, because we were fighting World War II in 1944. But there are three major issues. Number one, the economy. Number two, the economy. The economy. That really determines the presidential election. Now, I don't mean to say that other issues are unimportant. In these battleground states that you can see, in 2022, we had a midterm election where we elect the entire House of Representatives plus 1/3 of the U.S. Senate. In the 2020 election, just this past November, inflation, which is, of course, an economic issue, was the number one issue. But abortion was second. And in some states, it was even more important than the economy. And this surprised political scientists, because usually it's not an issue. But it became an issue when the Supreme Court stated that Roe versus Wade, which granted the right of abortion to women, was unconstitutional. They handed the Democrats a really big issue. The third issue is crime, and as you can see, it's not really a significant issue. Well, what about foreign policy? Well, about 7% of Americans think foreign policy is an important issue on which to base their vote. But that was until Russia invaded Ukraine. So Americans see NATO and Ukraine positively, but view Russia negatively and see it as the enemy of the U.S. So that will be the theme of foreign policy that will energize voters in the 2024 presidential election. Americans who prioritize global engagement are much more likely to express confidence in Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And as you can see from this chart, it's primarily Democrats. So the Democrats are going to stand very firm with Ukraine and very firm against Russia. But of course, abortion is still a major issue. People thought, okay, well, the Supreme Court rendered its decision in June of 2022. It's going to go away. Americans have a short memory. Not so as far as abortion is concerned. And you can see here a recent demonstration against the Supreme Court decision. That building in the background is the Supreme Court. Now, I want to give you just one or two positive things about our government. I know I've been beating on the government, my government, for a while. But one of the good things is that the Congress is diverse, increasingly with Jewish members, increasingly with Hispanic members, increasingly with Asian members, and increasingly with women, who now make up almost 1/3 of the U.S. Congress, even though they make up more than 50% of the U.S. population. But you can see the trend line, and this is a positive. Younger generations are also making up a growing share of Congress, especially in the House. Now, I have nothing against old people, but it is important to energize young people. In 2012, my students went out and voted for Obama. They were excited about voting for Obama. 2016, they said, "Oh, I don't know. I have a lot of homework. It's cold outside. I went to a party last night. I don't know if I'm going to vote." No enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton. The most democratic group in America are the 18 to 29-year-old voters voting for the Democratic Party. But if they don't vote, the Democrats don't get the vote. I can tell you which group votes for which party, but if they don't come out to vote, it's not relevant. But in 2020, nearly 40% of this age group, 18 to 29, went out to vote for Joe Biden. In 2016, 28% came out to vote for Hillary Clinton. And that really could have been the difference of victory or defeat. So, in addition to saying what the three most important issues are, what is going to determine the 2024 election is turnout, turnout, turnout. Who turns out? The younger the voter, the more democratic. And right now, here are the candidates. Of course, Joe Biden, these other two candidates are not going to be very important, but I'll include them anyway. But Joe Biden will be the Democratic candidate. And for the Republicans, already, you can see they have 7 candidates. And that is to the benefit of Donald Trump, because in any primary, Republican primary that he runs, he's going to get at least 30 to 35%. And the rest is going to be split among these other candidates. So the more candidates come into the Republican race, the better it is for Donald Trump. So when I come back here next year at this time, we'll have a better idea of who's running and who is winning. Now, the American seal, as you can see here, is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And boy, I can tell you, we have had a very difficult time becoming one. But we done that with the help of our leadership. And the 2024 presidential election will make a big statement and a big march forward in securing that unity. Thank you all very much.